So tonight, the title of my talk is What Insight Really Is, which is slightly scary to give a talk on. But as you probably know by now, we've been looking at the Bodhisattva path. Somewhere in there's a flip chart with the Bodhisattva path on it. We've been looking at the Bodhisattva path, which is the path of the person, the practitioner, who is seeking to move towards enlightenment, not just to be happier themselves, but in order to be able to help others to grow and develop as well, to be part of, if you like, the evolution of consciousness on this planet. Someone who sees themselves as a helper in the process of the human race growing up and becoming at least a little bit sane. So the Bodhisattva it can sometimes seem like a Bodhisattva is a sort of super Buddhist, but according to the Buddha, this should be part of our motivation at all times, actually. So over and over again in the Pali Canon, the oldest recorded words of the Buddha, over and over again, the Buddha tells his followers to practice. It's a phrase that crops up over and over again, for the welfare of the many. Practice for the welfare of the many, for the well-being of gods and men. And he doesn't just say this when he's talking to enlightened arahants. He says this even when he's telling people off. He says, you're not practicing for the welfare of the many. Do it differently. You're not behaving, the way you're behaving is not conducive to the welfare of the many. You're not living according to my teaching. So the Bodhisattva ideal of practicing for something a bit larger than our own personal liberation and happiness, that is very much part of original Buddhism. It's part of the Buddha's teaching. And it should be at least part of the motivation of anyone who's seriously trying to practice the Dharma. Okay, sometimes our focus is needs to be, on more liberating ourselves from negative mental states, because that's necessary. But the more we can do that, the more use we can be, the more we can stop being part of the problem and start being part of the solution. So we need to see our practice as part of the bigger picture. And that's what the Bodhisattva idea is getting at. So we've been looking at the Bodhisattva path, and we've been doing this by looking at the most common formulation of the path, the 10, as they're called, paramitas. Paramita, sometimes translated perfection, can also be translated as ways beyond. So ways beyond our limited self. The 10 practices that take us beyond our limited present self. So we've looked at them, and this is a test for me, see if I can remember them. We've looked at generosity. We've looked at ethics. We've looked at patient forbearance. We've looked at energy. And now we're looking at meditation. For the last few weeks, we've been looking at meditation. And in the last few weeks, we've heard a lot about the benefits of meditation. Meditation brings greater awareness. It brings greater enjoyment of the world around us, greater appreciation of beauty, greater appreciation of all sorts of simple pleasures. It makes us more aware of what's going on in our minds, more aware of feelings that are normally below the threshold of consciousness, but still affect us. Helps us to find ways to weaken and control unhelpful mental habits. Helps us to become more integrated, more whole, so that the different parts of ourselves can work harmoniously together, rather than fighting each other. Meditation is very pleasurable, blissful even. It can open the way to states of mind that are full of beauty and delight. It can help us to develop warm emotions, to let go of old resentments, improve our relationships. Traditionally, doing the Metta Bhavana is said to help us sleep soundly, awake refreshed, to make people like us, to make us attractive, to make us look beautiful. Why wouldn't we want it? If you could market a product that had those effects, what could you charge for it? You'd make a fortune. You'd make a fortune if you could market a product like that. But apparently all of that is just completely by the by, byproducts, mere byproducts. According to the sort of Ladybird Book of Buddhism version, all of that is sort of irrelevant, and the real purpose of meditation, the reason we should do it, is that it can give us insight. Insight into the nature of reality, insight into the way things are. So traditionally there are said to be two aspects of meditation. Firstly, there's what's called samatha meditation, and secondly, there's what's called vipassana meditation. So samatha meditation is meditation that calms the mind, clarifies the mind. It leads to the dhyana states that Satyajoti talked about a few weeks ago. One ancient Chinese teacher talks about samatha meditation as the entrance into the wonderful silence and peace of potentiality. G-E, if that's how you pronounce it. So samatha meditation, and then there's vipassana meditation. So vipassana meditation, which is meditation aimed at insight into the way things are. Traditionally, it's said that insight can only be achieved in a heightened, clarified state of consciousness. It can only be achieved in a dhyana state. So the analogies for that are often used are like muddy water. So the mind is usually all shaken up. It's like muddy water. And you can't see the light through it, but it needs to settle down. And samatha meditation allows it to settle down. And then vipassana meditation is seeing the light through the clarified water. Or another analogy that's sometimes used is an old battered torch. So the mind is sometimes, in its normal state, the mind is like an old torch where the bulb's a bit sort of old and the glass is all dirty and the beam is totally unfocused. So we're stumbling around and we can hardly see anything with this torch. And what samatha meditation does is clean off the dirt, replace the bulb, tighten up the beam, and hey, I can see clearly now. So those are analogies for samatha and vipassana meditation. And some meditations are mainly aimed at the samatha aspect. The mindfulness of breathing is often said to aim at the samatha aspect. Some meditations are specifically aimed at achieving insight, like the 6-element practice that people do when they're well on the way in training for ordination into Triratna. Or various others, or in fact the visualization practices which order members take on at ordination are, in a way, vipassana practices. And all that might sound rather glamorous, why don't we get on to the vipassana practices? But to have an effect, those practices have to be done on the basis of a strong foundation of samatha. The tradition says that there's absolutely no point in trying to get vipassana meditations off the ground unless you've got the sort of subtle, focused, clear, powerful mind that you develop through samatha meditation. We can't rush straight to insight, trying to make what Sangha calls a smash and grab raid on the transcendental. Insight comes as part of a progressive path of practice. And, the so-called vipassana meditations don't have a monopoly on leading to insight. The mindfulness of breathing and the metta bhavana, although they are mainly often seen as samatha practices, they can both lead to insight. Indeed, it's said that the Buddha was doing the mindfulness of breathing when he broke through into full enlightenment. So that's hardly a sort of beginner's practice. It's not something we should hurry past to get to the glamorous stuff. So when our mind is calm and energized and focused, if it's a mind that's steeped in the Dharma, insights can arise quite spontaneously from doing, for example, the mindfulness of breathing, without us necessarily striving for it intentionally. Or maybe you've discovered that in a small way in your own practice. I mean, it's quite a common experience to get just really good ideas while we're sort of focused in meditation. That's great. I usually want to leap up and write them down, which is not very conducive. Or minor insights. Those things happen when our mind is unified. So all this is what you will read, what I've just said, is what you will read in a good introduction to Buddhism, like the one what I wrote. So in a book like that, you'll read that the Buddhist path consists of the threefold path of ethics, meditation, and wisdom. So on the basis of a practice of ethics, we can begin to practice meditation. We practice meditation, we develop a strong basis of samatha, and that can then be extended into vipassana, and then that leads to wisdom. However, there are a couple of problems with this nice, neat formulation. Firstly, as Sangha actually himself has pointed out, it's all a little bit less clear than that, a bit less neat. People's meditation experiences, often doing the metta bhavana, are often what lead them to be more ethical, rather than the other way around. Or people get involved in the Dharma because they have a vipassana experience, they have an insight experience, and that leads them to take up meditation and start practicing ethics. In fact, all three aspects of the path tend to develop together. They tend to develop together, perhaps in a sort of spiral way, progressing one, reinforcing all the others, sort of helping all the others. Sangha actually likens it to more like the unfolding of the petals of a flower than a path where you do one thing and then the other thing and then the other thing. So it's not like that. And anyway, there are lots and lots of important aspects of Buddhist practice that are just hinted at in this formulation. We can't really reduce something as complex as the spiritual growth of a human being to three nice, neat words: ethics, meditation, and wisdom. Wouldn't it be nice if we could? Wouldn't it be easy to understand? So that's the first problem. It's all a bit too tickety-boo, it's a bit too sort of neat. And the second problem is the use of the word insight to describe the wisdom which is the goal. So insight in our language and our culture tends to mean a sort of, it's a deep intellectual knowing, but it's an intellectual knowing. We might hear that it's something we do with our head, just our head alone. So we might hear, for example, that some scholar has a deep insight into, the causes of World War II, or someone has got a deep insight into anthropology or something like that. And this makes it sound as though the goal of Buddhism is a sort of intellectual understanding, as though it's something that just concerns the head. And often in the West, that goal, that insight, that wisdom is equated with insight into non-self. That's what it is. It's all about insight into non-self. And all too often this happens it's taken in a very heady way. So, for example, So when that happens, it tends to lead to a very incomplete and one-sided approach to the spiritual life, in which practices like the metta bhavana and friendship and even ethics are ignored. And that practice just doesn't go anywhere. Just focusing on insight into non-self without doing the rest of the spiritual life doesn't go anywhere, because it doesn't tackle a really deep-rooted self-centeredness, which is based on emotions and deep drives, and is not touched by what goes on in the top 2 inches of our head. So the fact is that insight is a very bad word for insight, because it feeds so well into our overemphasis on the intellect and our underemphasis on the emotions and the deeper, darker aspects of our being, which tends to characterize modern Western culture. So, for example, one Western writer about Buddhism, a guy called Trevor Ling, describes the Buddha's insight, the Buddha's enlightenment, as intellectual penetration into the nature of the human situation. Intellectual penetration. But insight is much, much more than intellectual penetration. Full insight is described in one tradition as a turning around in the deepest seat of consciousness, a turning around in the deepest seat of our being. And the deepest seat of our being is not all about our ideas, it's about our emotions, it's about our volitions, it's about our desires, our deepest drives. So I've heard Padma say, and he may deny this, that we should completely stop talking about insight. Just don't use the word. Don't use the word. Because it just leads to complete misunderstanding of what the spiritual life is about. And we need to find a different way of talking. However, tonight we're stuck with the word insight because that's in the title of the talk. So the title of the talk is What Insight Really Is. So I'm going to say a bit about what it is and what it isn't. So here is something Sangha has to say which is related to the subject. The enlightenment of the Buddha was not a cold, detached knowledge. He saw with warmth. He saw with feeling. What is more, he saw everything as being pure, or shubha, which also means beautiful. The Buddha saw everything as pure beauty because he saw everything with compassion, just as conversely, when you hate someone, they appear ugly. When out of metta you see things as beautiful, you naturally experience joy and delight. And out of that joy and delight flow spontaneity, freedom, creativity, and energy. This flow from metta to joy to freedom and energy is the constant experience of the Bodhisattva. The Bodhisattva's wisdom, in the fullest sense, therefore includes metta. In a sense, we could even say that metta is wisdom, is prajna. So he's putting that in terms of wisdom, but I mean, we could rephrase it, sort of putting in the word insight in there, because that's the subject of the talk, and we could say insight is not a cold, detached knowledge. Insight involves seeing with warmth, seeing with feeling. What is more, it involves seeing everything as subha, beautiful. The person with the Buddha's insight sees everything as pure beauty because they see everything with compassion, just as conversely, when we hate someone, they appear ugly. When out of metta we see things as beautiful, we naturally experience joy and delight. And out of joy and delight flow spontaneity, freedom, creativity, and energy. This flow from metta to joy and freedom and energy is the constant experience of the Bodhisattva who has sustained insight. The Bodhisattva's insight in the fullest sense includes metta. We could even say that metta is insight, is wisdom, is prajna. So we could take several things from that. I mean, one is that it's about seeing. He talks about how the Buddha sees, and we probably all know that how we see is deeply, deeply connected to what we're feeling. So you can see the same street twice, and once it's beautiful and another time it's threatening, according to the way we're feeling. We can take two other things, I think, from that. So, that heightens up the importance of emotion. So firstly, the crucial role of positive emotions, like metta, in any real insight experience. Any turning about in the deepest seat of being is going to have more to do with the emotions than it does with intellectual ideas. So as Sangha says here, we can approach insight through metta. We can approach insight through metta. Metta can be a path to insight. If you were on the recent study day on the Karaniya Metta Sutta, one of the early Buddhist texts, you'll have heard that it says that the practice of metta can take us beyond our delusion, beyond all our wrong views. It can lead to insight. And for us Westerners, who often have really sharp intellectual understanding, we've often been really quite highly educated, we've got sharp intellectual understanding, but we're also often maybe a bit out of touch with warm emotion. Maybe. It might be good to focus for a while on approaching insight more through metta than through sort of intellectual understanding. Developing metta and empathy for others rather than seeking to contemplate non-self, for example. That might lead to a more balanced approach, and it might lead to a more successful approach. So Sangha says in another text, the terminology of insight is cognitive, but it could just as well be emotional. It's a total experience. It affects all of you. It's not that the insight experience has either an intellectual or an emotional basis. It isn't a one-sided thing. So it affects the whole being. It involves both the intellect and the emotions and all the rest, all the deep drives. In fact, elsewhere, Sangha says that spiritual truth is perceived by a faculty that is neither thinking nor feeling, neither the intellect nor the emotions, neither thinking nor feeling. But it's a faculty that includes both. He calls this the spiritual faculty. He says these thinking and feeling, as we practice, they come together, whereas often our thinking and feeling seem to be pointing in different directions. As we practice, they come together. They get unified into a single way of looking at the world, which involves both the clarity, if you like, of intellectual understanding, but also the sort of perception of value and beauty that you get from feeling. So yeah, he says it's that spiritual faculty, union of thinking and feeling, that can allow us to perceive spiritual truth. So it's that faculty that we use to see the reality of things, that we use to see insight. And elsewhere in his writings, in the Survey of Buddhism, Sangha talks about how we can approach Buddhism how we can approach insight through what's called Shraddha. So Shraddha is usually translated as faith, but Sangha describes it as the response of what is ultimate in us to what is ultimate in the universe. So it's a sort of intuitive connection with something higher than ourselves, and it's a love of that connection, a desire to move towards that something. Why are we here? Because there's something speaks to us. There's something speaks to us, and it's difficult to tie down. But there's something moving us forward, pulling us towards the self we could be, and that's Shraddha. So, a sense of connection to something higher than our ordinary self, a sense of love and devotion and longing to move towards that something, which we may be experiencing in our higher moments. And this is Shraddha is traditionally said to have three elements: a knowing element, knowing truths, a loving element, a desire to, just a deep affection, a deep love for certain qualities, certain sort of spiritual beauty, and a longing element, a longing from the guts, so head, heart, and guts, if you like, wanting to move towards it. So Shraddha combines thinking and feeling and willing. It involves all of us, rather like insight. In fact, according to Sangha, our Shraddha is what he calls a prefiguration of our insight, a prefiguration of wisdom, the wisdom that we'll one day achieve. It's as close as we get to it now. And by developing it and cultivating it, that itself can lead us towards insight. It will grow into full insight. Yeah, and also interestingly, Sangha says, well, that faculty of insight, that faculty of Shraddha is closely connected to our appreciation of beauty. And in the quote that I read out, in my slightly altered version, insight is not a cold, detached knowledge. Insight involves seeing with warmth, seeing with feeling. What is more, it involves seeing everything as Shubha, beautiful. The person with the Buddha's insight sees everything as pure beauty. And he also points out that the word that's usually used to describe the wisdom of the Bodhisattva, which is Vidya, which is usually translated to mean something intellectual. It's usually translated as knowledge, but in fact it has very different connotations. So the translator Gunther, for example, translates Vidya as aesthetic appreciation. Aesthetic appreciation. In other words, appreciation of beauty. And Sangha actually says that's much closer to its true meaning. He says Vidya is a sort of relishing of things, a sort of delight in things, a harmony with the world. And its opposite, avidya, conveys a sense of alienation and conflict. Certainly not an absence of knowledge in the usual sense of the word. So, to see with insight is to see the beauty of things. To open up to reality is to open up to beauty, the beauty of the world, the beauty of things, the beauty of people. So that needs to be part of our practice, actually, opening up to beauty, cultivating our appreciation of beauty, cultivating our response to beauty, thinking of the things that we find beautiful, and putting ourselves in touch with them, giving ourselves the space and the time to do that. So we need to think about, well, what do I find beautiful? What do I find beautiful? And how can I get more of it? Because that's not some distraction from the spiritual life. That is cultivating the faculty which will lead us to insight. That's cultivating the mental states which will lead us to insight. So insight involves seeing with warmth, seeing with metta. It's closely related to Shraddha, faith, or our response to the ultimate, and it involves seeing the beauty of things. It is a sort of knowing, but it's not knowing as we usually understand it. It's the sort of knowing that is more like the way we can know a piece of music, say. Or a poem, or a beautiful landscape, or indeed a person. So we don't know a piece of music by studying the score, if we can read music, by seeing where the key changes happen, where the woodwinds come in, etc., what the rhythm is. That's not to know a piece of music, is it? Not in its deepest sense. To know a piece of music, we have to merge our consciousness with it. We have to merge our attention with it. We have to allow ourselves to respond to its beauty. We have to love it. To know a landscape, to really know a landscape, we don't know it by knowing the geology and knowing the botanical classification of the various sorts of plants that we're going to find, or the wavelength of the blue in the sky or the green from the trees. We know it by appreciating it, by responding to its beauty, by loving it. We don't know a person by knowing their bank balance, their date of birth, their height and weight measurements. We know it by something else. Okay. And we all know this, that to know this way, to see the beauty in something, to love that beauty, we need to be in a particular mental state. Okay? We need to be in a particular mental state. We've probably all had the experience of I say classical concert because that's what I go to, going to a classical concert, piece of music that sometimes has seemed sublime to us, or we go for a walk through a landscape that sometimes transfixed us with its beauty, and we are completely unmoved. We are completely unmoved. We are alienated. We are cut off, wrapped up in our own concerns, unable to see the beauty in any way at all, because we're not in a right state to see that beauty. We have to be in a certain state, a state of being to appreciate beauty. And in just the same way, we have to be in a certain state of being to appreciate insight, to appreciate the world, to experience insight. If we want to experience insight, what we have to do is to cultivate the state of being that's open to it. There is no use in trying to sort of manufacture insight for ourselves by thinking about non-self or whatever, if we haven't cultivated that state of being which is open to insight. It's like going for a walk and saying, well, I'm going to really find this beautiful. I'm really going to find this beautiful. That's not the way to do it. So I think we could say that this certain state of being that we have to be in to be open to insight has two aspects. That the state of being that we have to cultivate has two aspects. We could say an inner aspect and a more outer aspect, which is about the way we're related to the world and other people. So the inner aspect, we've already said a lot about this. The path starts with ethics. To experience insight in a way that we can sustain, we need to be living a reasonably ethical life. We need to cultivate samatha, so we need to cultivate a clear, calm, bright, focused mind. We need a mind that's imbued with metta, as Sangha tells us. We need a touch of shraddha at some level. We need to have this ability to pay attention. So we need to be in a certain inner state. But also, we need to be in a sort of state of relationship with others in the world around us. We exist in relationship to the world and the people around us. We're not sort of separated beings. We exist in relationship. And an important part of our state relates to the sort of relationship that we have with the world and other people. We need to be in harmony. So a book by a guy called Michael McGee, who I believe is an order member, actually. Anyway, he's a philosopher. And he suggests that we need to be in what he calls a state of Sangha in our relationship to others, which I found quite interesting. We need to be part of a community of people characterised by metta, mutual support, shared aims and aspirations, transparent honesty, and deep communication. That's part of our state, is the state of our relationship to those around us. And that might relate, I think, to Sangharajta's, some of you all know Sangharajta's view of the bodhicitta, the mind of enlightenment. And he says of that it's much more likely to arise among a group of close friends working together for a common project than it is in an individual. So yeah, we need to be in a state of harmony with the world, a state of Sangha with at least some other people, and a state of Sangha, of harmony in our general relationship with other people. So ethics, samatha meditation, metta, shraddha, Sangha, study, so that we're imbued with the Dharma. All that is what we need to cultivate to experience sustained insight. That's quite a lot to be getting on with, actually. I don't know if that might ring some bells. It sounds awfully like Buddhist practice, in a sort of general sense. And you might notice that I've been talking about sustained insight over the last few minutes. Not just insight, I've been talking about sustained insight. And there's a reason for this, because anyone who works in a Buddhist centre for any period will have met people who seem to have had genuine, strong insight experiences, but don't fit any of these categories, okay? Seem to live a relatively unethical life, may not be that ethical, may not be noticeably imbued with metta or shraddha, may not have many close friendships, let alone being part of a Sangha, may not even be very good at meditation, may not have a strong basis of samatha, or any basis of samatha, do not experience the calm, clear mind I've been talking about, except maybe occasionally by accident. Yet they say that they have had these big insight experiences. And we have no reason to doubt them, I think that for some centre workers this can be puzzling, or even a bit undermining. And personally, I am absolutely sure that people like this can have insight experiences. I speak as one who knows, because I think I've experienced that before I started practicing the Dharma, actually, and was living a really quite unskillful life. I don't think it's at all uncommon to have a glimpse of something, to get a glimpse, which may seem like a very major experience because it can be so much in conflict with our normal way of living. In fact, Sangha in his book on meditation says, the more unethical we are, the more our way of life doesn't fit the Dharma, the more it's likely to seem like a huge experience. Whereas if we're living a relatively dharmic life, it may come more gently. It may seem more gentle. We can have these major experiences, but they're so in conflict with the rest of the way we feel and act and live that they have very little long-term effect. They just go. They just go, unless we do something about it. So I think we need to distinguish between having insight experiences and having the sort of sustained insight that lasts and that flavours everything we feel and everything we think and everything we will and everything we do and the whole way we live. And this is why we talk about the path of vision and transformation. So if you cast your mind back to the intermediate course, you'll remember we talk about the Eightfold Path being divided into the path of vision and the path of transformation. And we say that, well, many people have vision experiences, but in a way that what that needs to do is to permeate through the rest of our behaviour. So all those other aspects of the path, our emotions, our speech, our action, our livelihood, our effort, our meditation, it needs to permeate the rest of our life so that we are transformed in the light of that insight, so that we become we become aligned with that insight. We live in a way that makes that insight part of us. So what is important is not to have the glimpse. What is important is transforming our whole being and our whole life to make that glimpse of reality the driving force for the way we live. So insight experiences are not an end in themselves. They don't mean much unless they're part of a process of growth towards becoming a larger person, a less limited person, a less self-centered person, a more humble person, a person more willing and able to serve. Unless they serve that purpose, who cares? Who cares? What is important is that they feed into a process of growth. So to round off, well, what does all this mean for us? What does it mean for our practice? Well, firstly, I think it's obvious from what I've said that we need an all-round approach to the spiritual life that works on all aspects of our being, our action, our emotions, all aspects of our beings, and not just go for insight, An aspect of that is that we need to see the role and also the limits of the intellect, of intellectual understanding. Because I don't want what I've said to mean that there is no value in studying and reflecting and meditating on what Buddhism has to say about the nature of reality. There is a real value in that. There's a real value in studying those words. It's valuable, but it's valuable as part of an all-round approach where we work on the other aspects of our being as well. So beyond that, it is really difficult to give advice on how we approach insight or having insight experience because people are so different. But I'm going to risk a huge generalization, and say that I think we can distinguish between two types of people. Most of us are somewhere in between, but at the extremes we can distinguish between two types of people. So first of all, we've talked about vision and transformation and the two aspects of the path. So I think we can talk about vision-led people and transformation-led people. So vision-led people maybe have a big vision right before they start practicing or very early on in their practice. And I think actually that was me, so I can say rude things about them. that might sound all very glamorous. That might sound all very glamorous to be vision-led, but it's really risky. It's really risky because one thing is it can lead to what's called inflation. We can start to think, I've really got somewhere because I've had this big experience. So it leads to a sort of spiritual arrogance, which then, that's it for the spiritual life. You won't listen to anyone, just go off on your own. Seen it. I mean, this is not theory. This is seen over and over again, working in the Buddhist Centre. That sort of, I've had this big experience, I am really something. Out of here, just next thing you know, heaven knows what people are doing, becoming Jehovah's Witnesses or something. That's one problem with it. And I'm sure there's another one, but I can't remember what it is. So we need to be humble about those experiences. And the second is that if we think then the spiritual life is about cultivating that, I've had that experience, I've got to cultivate that experience, it leads to this really one-sided approach to the spiritual life. So that's vision-led. Vision-led people need to focus on the path of transformation. Okay, follow the vision, but it's the path of transformation that really matters. And I'm going to quote something now that was told to me, and I hope you don't mind, I'm going to say something that was said to somebody here. There's an order member who used to be here called Maitri Siddhi who was speaking about this, and she said to somebody who asked her, who was a bit in a similar vein, for people like us, that's vision-led people, for people like us, the work of many lifetimes is bridging the gap between our meditation experiences and ourselves as we are now. And I think I experienced that, actually. I talked a few weeks ago about having this experience of getting into wonderful meditative states and then feeling, just hitting a brick wall. And I said that I had this vision of myself as a plank in the mud, and with an elastic band attached to it. And I grabbed hold of the elastic band in my meditation experiences and sort of raised it up to high levels. And the plank had moved 0.5 millimetre. And then it went clack. And then I realised, okay, down in the mud, if you want to get anywhere, lift the plank. It's not about what you do with some small part of yourself, but it can exist in meditation. Vision-led people, I think, need a particular path of practice, which is to focus on the path of transformation. Feet on the ground, working on ethics, working on friendship, working on mindfulness, working on metta. And then we have a different sort of practitioner, which is the transformation-led person. And transformation-led person, they might even be nicer people. They might live really ethical lives. They might, but they don't have those experiences. And they sort of think, well, I wish I had those experiences. They're inspired by changing and growing and becoming more ethical and having better relationships, and that is what inspires them. But no glimpse of anything beyond that. And that can all seem a bit, a bit sort of dull. So for such people, I think the path is maybe a bit different. I think then in that case, what we need to do is cultivate vision experiences. Go on solitary retreat. Get a meditation practice. It's shocking how many of the people turn up here don't have meditation practices. We need to meditate. Yeah? That means we need to get a place to meditate and a time to meditate and something to meditate on and etc. We need to meditate. We're Buddhists, for God's sakes. And then cultivate that. Go on solitary retreat. Go on retreats. Develop that. Open up. Cultivate even visionary, open up to visionary and archetypal experiences. Chant mantras. Do things to have an experience of something that's beyond the workaday world. Okay? And that would be precisely the wrong advice for a vision-led person, because they go, whoa! And you wouldn't see them for dust. It'd be out in stratospheric something or other. So we need to think maybe where we lie in that spectrum. Most of us probably lie somewhere in between. But we may find ourselves at one extreme or the other, because that's going to really sort of determine, in a way, our approach to meditation practice and to practice in general. What do we need to cultivate? What do we need to cultivate? So I'll leave that with you, perhaps as the final thought, and perhaps that could be our discussion question. So let's split up into some smaller groups.